I think that what I would most want to share is for people to check in with their fears. If you are at the point where you are contemplating coming out, get some support from somebody who can help you have a look at what those fears are. Because, like I had said before, it's very easy to blow them up into something that is much, much bigger and can weigh very heavily on you. I never would have pictured 6 years ago when I left my marriage that I would be living with this incredible woman and sharing my life with her and planning a wedding. Those were things that I really could not see, but I took one step at a time. And I guess that would be my suggestion to everybody, is just one step at a time.
Welcome to Graying Rainbows, the podcast community for people coming out LGBT plus later in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. No matter where you are on your journey, I hope these stories will help you feel less alone. Before I jump into today's interview, I want to remind you that you can find more episodes of Graying Rainbows at grayingrainbows.com. And you can subscribe for free in your favorite podcasting app. You can send me email at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. Submit voice feedback at speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis. And you can post to our Graying Rainbows fan page on Facebook. The most important announcement I need to make has to do with our Facebook group, because there are many of you who have been worried about the lack of privacy protections on Facebook. I've created a new group on MeWe. This will provide a safe place for everyone, including those of you who are not yet out publicly. I encourage you to visit MeWe.com to learn more about their privacy policies, and then send a request to join our group to me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. Midge and I have been trying to get the word out to those in the Facebook group. So if you already belong to that group, you can send Midge Noble a request or email me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com, whichever's easier for you. I want to encourage everyone to change over. Even if you don't necessarily need the privacy, appreciate that it's important to others and they need your support. So I need to try to get everybody transitioned over to MeWe, even though I realize it's a little inconvenient to go to another location if you really like to hang out on Facebook. My guest today is Rosemary Cianfarani. Rosemary lives in Canada, and I think many of you will identify with her story. What do you do when you love your spouse, but you realize you're gay? I'll be back after the interview with a few closing thoughts. So, Rosemary, it is fantastic to have you on Graying Rainbows, and I really appreciate your volunteering to share your story with me today. What I usually like to do is just let people tell their story in their own words.
I guess that I realized maybe 20 years ago that I'm gay. And at that time, I was already married and had 4 small children, and kind of felt at that time that I was stuck. So I stayed in the marriage and continued to raise my children, which in part led to me becoming very depressed and struggling with anxiety and depression for many years. I started to see a therapist at that time and realized that I needed to be more honest with myself and start moving towards figuring out what it was that I wanted to do. So at that time, the first person that I came out to, other than my 2 best friends, was my now ex-husband. And, the agreement that we made at that time was that we would stay in the marriage and try to make things work the best that they could. That became really difficult for me. I was not happy, continued to struggle with my mood and anxiety. And I decided at that time that I needed to leave the marriage, which was a very hard choice. I knew that it was going to be very difficult in terms of the reaction of the family, being my parents, his parents, and also had a lot of fears and worries about the children and how they were going to fare in all of this. So that kept me in the marriage for a long time. I really have left the marriage 6 years ago. So I was probably maybe 16 or 18 years before I felt like I was ready to do that. So it was a long time.
I went to one of the live events actually last year and in Nashville, and listening to other people, share their various stages in their story. And one of the things that struck me was that there seemed to be several women in the group who were really in bad marriages, right? And their marriages would have been bad even if they hadn't realized they were gay. In your case, did you feel like that was true, or was it just the being gay that was the problem?
I think every marriage has its struggles, and we had our ups and downs, absolutely, for sure. No, I don't believe that I would have left the marriage if it wasn't that I realized that I was gay. It wasn't because the marriage was a horrible marriage.
And that makes it much more difficult.
Absolutely. We both left the marriage still loving and caring about each other and wanting the best for one another. Of course, we had our ups and downs and our fights throughout all of this because it's a scary thing for everybody. But we didn't leave the marriage at that time angry or upset with one another. We still do both care about one another.
So since I know you're new to my podcast, I will recommend you look back through the feed there's an interview with a woman from something called the Straight Spouses Network. I think you might find her interview very interesting and helpful, and it might be something you might want to share with your ex. You just listen to it and see what you think. And actually, I've gotten a lot of responses to that interview, and I've learned from the feedback I've gotten that people solve this problem in all kinds of different ways, if solving is the right word. There's no one-size-fits-all. There's even a woman who's written a book called Married Women Who Love Women, and it's about to come out in its third edition. The first edition I remember reading back in the 90s. She's actually still with her husband, but there's also a third person, and it's like a kind of an unusual solution. But then I've also heard from men who stayed in their marriages with the understanding. So it's a hard. I just wanted to acknowledge that it's a hard decision. So how old were your children when you finally decided to end the marriage?
I exited the marriage about 6 years ago. We told the kids a couple of years before that. So we did cohabitate in the house for a couple of years after we made that decision. So my children right now, my youngest is 17, and then I've got 22, 25, and 27. So they were in their late teens, except for my daughter.
Right. So they were at the age where it's different when it's younger children and you have a divorce. That's a whole different thing. How were they able to just when you first told them that you were gay, how'd that go?
Well, I actually told my boys probably about 6 months before I told my daughter. And the reason that was is because my daughter, it's a challenge for her to keep anything to herself. And I hadn't spoken to my parents yet. So I told the boys, and, I have to say that was a moment in my life that was probably one of the scariest. I really wasn't sure how it was going to go, how they were going to respond. I have to say that it was also a really proud moment because all three of my sons at the time, their reaction was, okay, you're mom and we love you and things are going to change. We understand that. That's going to be hard. It doesn't change how we feel about you. I have to say that it was a lot different than I expected. I did kind of amp myself up to think that it was going to be quite horrible and really challenging. And as hard as it was, my boy's response was amazing. And I have to say that in part was my ex-husband was there when I told the boys and was very supportive to them and also to me. He didn't want them to think that this was my fault, that I had done something wrong. So I really believe that helped as well, that I had his support at that time to do that. And then I told my daughter about 6 months later after I when I was ready to tell my parents. She was great as well. She's younger, so she's with me a lot more and has probably at this point, she's had her 2 moms go to the school. And so things for her have been a little bit different, but she has also embraced it and embraced my fiance as well.
Back up to when you first told your husband, was that many years before you actually finally, I know you told me, but I've lost track of the timing.
I think I probably told him about 2 years before I actually started to understand that for me, the healthiest thing was going to be for me to leave the marriage. So we did try to make it work during that time.
Yeah. Well, for me, I told my husband, gosh, I can't even remember when, because we decided to stay together and we didn't have kids, so our lives were a lot less complicated. In my case, I actually didn't do anything until after my husband died. But like I said, everybody's choices are different. What about your parents? Because, so many of us when we're older, parents are not the issue, but it sounds like parents were a big issue for you.
That's interesting. Actually, I've had that conversation with my therapist a few times because she has said that most often people are more afraid of what others are going to think in terms of even just the general population or work people. For me, it was always my parents. My family's Italian, Catholic. I really felt like the reaction was not going to be positive. And it wasn't 100% positive. My parents struggled with this. They struggled with the fact that I was getting divorced, what that was going to look like for my children. Was that a healthy choice for my kids? How was this all going to affect them? Their own fears, their own embarrassment. I was at that time disappointed in the way that they reacted initially, but I did understand that it took me a long time to come out and to wrap my head around this. And they needed that same luxury to be able to kind of sort this out for themselves and move through it and get whatever supports they needed. My parents are supportive. I'm very loved and supported by everybody. It did take some time for them to wrap their head around it, though.
But fortunately, you had the maturity to realize that they needed that time to wrap their head around it. Yeah, one of my early guests pointed out that we struggle for years and years and years, and when we finally tell our loved ones, we might forget that they may feel totally blindsided. They might not see it coming. You might have someone that goes, oh, yeah, I had this experience of friends going, oh, you're the last one to figure it out. But, there's always the people who really didn't have a clue and that they need some time
to figure that out, for sure. And there's a coming out for them as well. When they start to tell family members or friends or whoever it is that they're connected to, that's a coming out process for them as well. And it is very scary for them as well.
That's why the organization PFLAG, which is, are you familiar with PFLAG?
Yes.
It's been around for a long time. I mean, it was originally started by a mother who was trying to provide support for other mothers who were in the same situation she was in. So what was the most surprising thing so far in this journey?
I think one of the surprising things, when I was worrying so much about telling my parents, when I was worrying so much about telling my family, I built up the fear to a point that I really convinced myself my dad was just going to have a heart attack. He was going to have a heart attack and he was going to die and that was going to be it. I was going to be responsible for his death at that moment. And, as much as that sounds ridiculous, I really believed that. I was really very frightened. And so it was definitely when this I told everybody and, they had to go through their own adjustment, but nothing terrible happened. And I was living in a lot of fear that something really terrible was going to happen. I'm very fortunate. There is nobody in my life who I have told who has had a negative reaction. I have received support at every turn.
Where do you live?
I'm living now north of Toronto, but I was living in Mississauga for most of my life. I have surrounded myself with amazing people, and I really received a lot of support, a lot of love and a lot of support. The reason I say that was surprising is because I guess I had also a lot of fears that there were people that would maybe walk out of my life. And I'm very fortunate not one person did.
But you had to take that chance. And so the fact that it didn't happen takes nothing away from the courage that it takes to take the chance.
That's right. And I know it doesn't turn out that way for everybody. I went back to school before I left the marriage and became a psychotherapist. So I do work sometimes with people who are gay. And I know it doesn't turn out that way for everybody, but it did for me. And that was a very pleasant surprise.
So how did you meet your fiance?
My fiance and I actually met at a group that we both turned up at several years ago. And we became friends. I had some stuff going on in my life at the time that she could relate to. And she reached out and we were friends for about 2 years. We both really liked one another, but we were both in other relationships. So we maintained the friendship for those couple of years. And then at some point we were both single and started to spend more time together. And the rest is history.
Because that's one of the problems that a lot of us are facing is how do you even meet somebody?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, and that would be trouble even if we were straight at our age.
For sure. For sure it is. It's a different world. I did try the online dating and, was not really a big fan of it. So, I was very very pleasantly surprised when the two of us were able to develop our relationship in this direction. So we actually had our wedding planned for July, and we are throwing a very big Italian Portuguese wedding. Have been very excited about it. Unfortunately, because of COVID-19, we have had to postpone our wedding. So it will now be in 2021, because that was kind of the first date that we could get that would work. So that's been difficult. Everybody is struggling right now, and it's a difficult time for everybody, but that has added, it's been a real disappointment. We've been very sad about it, but we have picked a new date and are putting all the plans in place to make that happen.
Well, since you're my first Canadian guest, why don't you tell me a little bit about what things are like in Canada in terms of LGBT rights and attitudes? Because as a fan of The Handmaid's Tale, Canada's getting this image of being like this wonderful place. Too cold for me. I'll have to put up with Alabama because I don't like cold weather. But what's it really like?
Well, I would have to say that Canada is nothing like The Handmaid's Tale at this moment. I'm also a big fan of that show as well. I can't really speak although I'm living in a smaller community at the moment, I can't really speak too much to the smaller communities. I live in Mississauga, which is a stone's throw from Toronto. And I would have to say that the attitudes in general towards LGBTQ folks is quite positive. Of course, that's been my experience. I can only speak to my experience, right? Actually, it's interesting because you mentioned PFLAG before. And before I actually came out, I went to Pride in Toronto, which is quite an amazing, beautiful event here. It's huge. I saw the PFLAG moms and dads marching. And it was at that moment, I was with a friend and I just burst into tears. It was a very emotional moment to see that these parents were supporting their young folks, their children, young adults who were coming out. So I would say that in terms of being a gay person in Toronto, I feel safe. There are certain moments in certain areas of Toronto where I feel safer to maybe be demonstrative or hold my fiance's hand. There's other areas where perhaps I wouldn't do that. So I think it's like anywhere. You just have to be a little smart and a little careful. But overall, I would have to say that I myself haven't encountered any negativity.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with my listeners before we close?
I think that what I would most want to share is for people to check in with their fears. If you are at the point where you are contemplating coming out, get some support from somebody who can help you have a look at what those fears are. Because like I had said before, it's very easy to blow them up into something that is much, much bigger and can weigh very heavily on you. I never would have pictured 6 years ago when I left my marriage that I would be living with this incredible woman and sharing my life with her and planning a wedding. Those were things that I really could not see, but I took one step at a time. And I guess that would be my suggestion to everybody is just one step at a time. And if you take a step backwards, don't beat yourself up for it. That's to be expected. Take a breath, ground yourself, and acknowledge the steps that you have taken going forward.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today, Rosemary. It's been wonderful to get to meet you. Maybe we'll meet in person someday.
That would be wonderful. And I'm happy to do it. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
When I got done talking with Rosemary, I felt that she had left out a large chunk of her story since she didn't talk much about the 20 years she spent battling anxiety and depression before she came out to her spouse and children. We actually corresponded about this after the interview, and she gave me permission not only to acknowledge this gap, but to make a few comments. One reason I wanted to share Rosemary's story is because, as I said in my introduction, I felt many listeners would identify with her journey. For example, even though I don't have any children, I identify with the fact that she did not want to hurt her husband. They had a good marriage, but like many of us, she found it difficult to experience true intimacy. On the surface, this might seem strange. If your spouse is your best friend, why should the lack of sexual intimacy prevent other kinds of intimacy? Maybe it doesn't have to, but when I look back on my own 38-year marriage, I realize that this was true for me. Another thing that people coming out LGBT plus later in life struggle with is how to tell their children and when to tell their children. This is probably the one issue that is changing the most, given that today most children are being raised in an atmosphere of acceptance. So if you're raising children now, things are very different than they were when Rosemary was raising hers. Of course, there are still plenty of people trapped in fundamentalist religions who face the potential of total rejection, not only by their children, but by everyone else close to them. We didn't spend much time talking about Rosemary's parents, but she did remind us of the importance of giving our family or anyone else close to us time to wrap their head around news that may come as a shock to them, no matter how long we've struggled before coming out publicly. That brings me to the last thing that stands out for me about Rosemary's story. Because she describes her actual coming out as if it went fairly smoothly, I think it's important to acknowledge the struggle and suffering that went before. She went into therapy because of anxiety and depression, but the true solution was accepting that she is gay. Coming out made it possible for her to meet her fiancé, but I strongly feel that being honest with ourselves is the key to our mental health. This is entirely separate from how we might choose to live our lives in the present moment. A person in a healthy marriage might choose to stay, either until the children are grown or even until the spouse dies, which is what I did. I want the Graying Rainbows community to be a safe place for you, no matter where you are on the journey. Almost every day, I get an email from someone looking for support. That is why I've moved our Facebook group to MeWe, where people can have total privacy. You can even use a pseudonym if safety is an issue. I especially want to encourage those of you who have already joined the Facebook group to move over to MeWe. As another safety measure, you will need a direct invitation from someone in the group in order to join. All you have to do is either message Midge on Facebook or email me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. MeWe doesn't have advertising, so I'm paying for a public page on the MeWe website. You can help Graying Rainbows reach more listeners by leaving a review in Apple Podcasts or posting to our fan page either on Facebook or on the new page on MeWe. Another way you can support Graying Rainbows is via Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/Graying Rainbows. I know that budgets are tight right now, but one nice thing about Patreon is that it allows you to pick a monthly amount that fits your budget, even if it's only $1 a month. My main expense is audio editing, so your help is greatly appreciated. Finally, I want to remind you that I'm always looking for people who are willing to share their stories. Just email me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. If you want to leave a really short version of your story, you can record that at speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis. For more episodes of Graying Rainbows, just go to our website at grayingrainbows.com or subscribe in your favorite podcasting app. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again next month. Graying Rainbows is copyright 2020 to Virginia Campbell, MD. You may copy it to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com.